Good day, Dr. Michael Fisher here, and it's FearTalk 34 in the series that I started 8 years ago on how to bring unique people together to talk about the topic of fear. And of course, I start with the premise that I don't think we know as much about fear as we may think we do. And so that becomes another intriguing way that we're here together to inquire, not necessarily to argue, there's places for that. We're actually here to explore and co-inquire and check out what each of us might be thinking about, something related to the fear dynamic, the fear pattern, sometimes I call it, the culture of fear, the fear matrix. I have all kinds of conceptions that I've been studying on this topic for a long time. But with guests like I have today, Randy Crutcher and Randy Morris, I think you're going to find some pretty interesting ideas as we do a threesome, the very first threesome of the Fear Talk series ever. So we will try a unique experience here as well. I will put links down below to both of your bios, so we don't have to do a long bio intro or anything like that. I want to actually just jump in unless you think something about your background's important, fellas. We'll just keep going, and I'm going to introduce the theme that I sort of usually put forward on different talks, but not on fear talks. But I want to talk about it today with you two because we've just been meeting in the last year and with Randy Morris, very recent in the last few months. And it's the theme of the enemy or enemies, call it what you will. And I was interested in that because obviously fear and enemy making are pretty closely connected. You can just imagine all kinds of intertwining there without even defining what those terms are, just in a kind of common sense way. So let me just kick us off before I get you guys jumping in. A couple experiences, and early experiences may be an interesting takeoff for you too. Early experiences, going to the zoo as a little kid, city of Calgary. All those days when they had the metal cages and it was pretty rough zoo conditions for our creatures that were behind those bars. But I remember reading the sign. I'm like, barely 5 or 6, and the food that they eat, where they're from. There's a little map and this little metal sign. And then it was always at the bottom, enemies of that creature. And the enemies would be listed. And I'd go to the next cage, always looking down, the enemies. There was some part of me wanted to know. Nowadays, we'd call them predators. And it's sort of interesting. Back in those days, it was actually called enemies. Another early experience, probably about 5, 6, again, in kind of rougher working class area. We lived on the top of the hill of the river valley, and the people lived down below. And it was the Italians that lived below, and we were the other up above on the hill crest. And believe it or not, 5 years old, my brother, 8 years old, got me into my first race wars where we actually were fighting, throwing rocks, glass at each other across race. Wasn't old enough to understand anything, but then they were below the hill and we were on the top of the hill. And that sounds pretty archetypal through a lot of human history. Well, then I had my latest experience working at a daycare center, volunteering. And this was in the last 4 years that I put myself into that world for the first time and tootled off to a daycare center in the area and then gave them a few ideas. I said I could do this and this with the kids. I could do some things with the staff development. And they thought, oh, okay, great. So this is basically a volunteer. And I was an artist in residence doing art. They knew I did art as well. And one of the things I learned very quickly is that when I'd sit in the classroom, well, first of all the staff, 98% are female. Okay, so now I've entered a culture, organizational culture. And once in a while, a male would come on, and then I'd hear comments from parents or staff or somewhere, I'm not leaving my kid in that classroom alone. This is 2026, 2025. I personally felt that the whole time I was there. Even though they befriended me as much as they could, I felt this constant sense that I was an enemy to children's safety.
Mm.
automatically, even though I'm vetted, right? Through the processes of to get into these places, you have to be vetted through RCMP, the police and so on. So those are a few experiences off the top. And so you guys, I invited you in to talk about the enemies. We're going to talk at all different kinds of levels. So I'll just intro full spectrum from biology of the enemy to spirituality of the enemy. We're wide open. And you like to jump in?
Well, if I may, Randy,
Go for it.
um, I'm thinking some of my first introduction to enemy was the World War II enemies of the Allied powers, the Axis and the Allied power versus the Axis versus the Allies. And what was interesting about that is the naming of the Krauts, the naming of the Japs. There was this; these names had a tone to them that signified as much as the actual text or words themselves. When people were sharing, adults were sharing that in conversation, you could feel the jagged edges of those words, Kraut and Jap. Um, and what's really interesting is that my uh, grandfather fought in trench warfare in World War One in the German army. He was a German immigrant that emigrated soon after World War One through Ellis Island. And so I grew up in a small German subculture. My mother would, that was her first language, even though she was born in LA. They took her back to Germany. Um, she was a child of the Depression. They took her back to Germany for 1 year. So her first language was actually German. They came back before the Axis fully took over and rose complete power. And came back to Los Angeles. Anyway, so I grew up with that language, and it was very confusing to me, right? Because here, my grandmother, my grandfather were German. My mother was speaking German. I was hearing German, but that was the enemy. So I'm not sure my young mind went to that place of, does that mean I'm the enemy? I'm not sure I was making that clear identification, but on some level, perhaps I was. So it actually probably was the earliest development of me questioning the whole idea of enemy. That what am I living with the enemy? Are the ones that love me and I love the enemy? The culture says yes. And my grandfather later, well, years later, we were taking apart my parents. Um, they had become deceased, and we're looking at my grandfather's albums, and every other page had photographs removed from the album, and only he and my grandmother and my mother would appear, and we're going, where are all the other people in their lives? What happened to these photos? They were the little black construction paper pages with the little corners, and the beat black and white photos were removed. And it suddenly dawned on me, my grandfather had removed those photos because there was an association with his German friends who were in a German culture club, and he could have been exposed to internment because he was a German living on the West Coast. And even though it was a small, much lesser known phenomenon, the German internment, it did exist, not on the scale of the Japanese. But I'm almost sure, but I never had that conversation, and my mother never shared that part of uh, the history. So that's my beginning salvo in this dialogue.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah, that's a great story, great ancestral story. So, and it reminded me of one of my own. I was born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest, and eastern and Washington State, eastern and western Washington State. But my family is from Virginia on my mother's side, and it turns out that my great great grandmother was a Virginia abolitionist in the 1850s, and freed all the family slaves and impoverished the family. and had five sons, all of whom were in their 20s when the Civil War broke out. So those five sons were all Virginians, but they were abolitionists. And
Mm.
so the question was, what side did they fight on? And they had to do this whole thing with conscience, and all five of them fought for the Confederacy because they were Virginians first. They identified as Virginians first, and so. But then they were fighting people who had the same beliefs that they did, and so it became this whole thing of, well, who's the enemy here, and by what criteria would I call someone an enemy? And it very quickly you begin to realize that this whole notion of the archetype of the enemy has both an inner and outer aspect to it. There's the inner enemy that gets projected onto the outer enemy, and that outer enemy then you need to destroy. But it turns out that what it is that you want to destroy is parts of yourself that you don't want to admit. And so that's where things start getting quite complicated about the nature of the enemy. And we should probably explore that whole notion of projection
Mm.
and the way in which, uh, you know, when you were talking about wartime propaganda, I was reminded of a great book by Sam Keane called Faces of the Enemy. It came out in 1986. And in it, he just explored all the posters and the newsreels and all the stuff around warfare, World War One and World War Two primarily, and discovered, there's just five or six basic archetypes to the enemy, sub-archetypes, or subcategories, if you will, of the archetype. Like it's really important that in order to get good people to kill other people, you have to name the enemy as vermin, as not worth living. We're seeing this today, of course, in the othering of minority populations in the United States. But you have to make it so not just that they're bad people or they're doing something, but they're eating cats and dogs. They're eating your cats and dogs. They're vermin. They don't deserve to live. That's the only way you can get anybody to do anything to them. If these people, if you have any conscience whatsoever. So there are certain patterns that create enough of an enemy to make you want to exterminate them. And it's a common psychological ploy. We've known it all this time. I don't understand why people can't see it at work. It's so right in front of your eyes, the way that whole projection of identification works. So
Was there
that's my
ever,
Well,
yeah, was there
Michelle,
ever a time in your life where you felt like you projected onto other people and then you finally were able to maybe make the awareness transition? Either one of you, where you felt like you had made enemies of others. I certainly did, as standing on the top of that hill, those were my enemy, and like kill or be killed. We even at the five age, it's just like who's gonna win?
oh, my dirt fort enemies.
Okay.
Yeah, as a little boy making dirt forts, and it was it wasn't even mock gang warfare. It got so intense with dirt clods as the ballistics that parents had to get together and convene a conference and settle all the kids down in the neighborhood because we had become that Lord of the Flies. We had shifted in that direction of the Lord of the Flies kind of mentality. But I won't say we went all the way. I think, we were like more like baseball teams who could have a halftime
Mhm.
or a break, football team that could have a halftime so that we weren't like completely, going to bed at night thinking, oh, Steve is, a mortal enemy and I better get him with a dirt clod and take him out tomorrow. But there was that energy that, and that animus happening in my boyhood. Where it exactly came from, I don't know. Our parents all got along. They weren't modeling that. It wasn't. So it probably, but we, of course, we were the first television generation. So we're exceedingly vulnerable to all the images and the war movies. And Randy, it was funny. I think Mikhail was grinning for a moment because you missed an email that I wrote today about Faces of the Enemy and Sam Keen. So we're already on the same wavelength. I wish I had a copy of that film and showed it every day to some group.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, so that was, yeah, that early experience with the projection and then the ganging up
Yeah.
around that. It's like, a single dog doesn't is not much of a threat, but when a group of dogs get together, they can become incredibly violent um, and terrorizing.
Hmm. Well, since we're mining our childhoods, I'm thinking of my childhood was spent growing up in the town of Richland, Washington, in eastern Washington, um, which is where the World War II town of Hanford used to be. And Hanford is where they created the plutonium for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And so growing up in that town where, your friends can't tell you what their dads do, there was,
Mhm.
secrets around. The commie scare was a really big thing in my 10 to 14 kind of age group, and I just remember, oh, those commies are going to come get you, and there was stories in the paper about the commies, because it was the height of the Cold War, and it was inflected by this whole nuclear thing and mutually assured destruction. And I remember when I got on a train to go to the East Coast when I was 14 to go to a boarding school. And I remember one night sleeping, and in the middle of the night, there was a big flash of light behind my eyeballs like that. I woke up like this. I went, oh my God, the bomb's hit. And I got out of bed, I ran into the closet, and I'm gathering together my stuff to run to the basement because that had been drilled into me year after year in Richland. Running down the hallway with my undies in my hands, and all of a sudden this huge boom hit the side of the building, and I realized that it was a thunderstorm, which I wasn't that familiar with since I had grown up where I did. And I just went, oh. And so I start separating, this dream world from the physical world, and realize, oh, it's not a nuclear bomb. But that imagination of a nuclear annihilation of your enemies, and we have to be prepared to do that. And the question of, well, who's going to push the button? And will they push the button when the time comes? How much do they hate the enemy? And then, of course, later realizing that, people who do have their finger on the button have been psychologically screened not to ask themselves those kinds of questions, because you can't be asking those kinds of questions. And at the same time, word has come out that there was, in fact, a Russian general, a Russian colonel, and not a high ranking general, who despite all of the incoming information that the US and Europe had launched an all out nuclear war, just didn't believe it. And so didn't push the button to correspond, which, if he had done it, would have ignited a world conflagration. And
So
he
you're
said,
saying he's
well,
saying we got saved by the enemy
we
across the
got
way.
saved by by the
I love that.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
conscience of the enemy.
I love that story.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
an
Yeah, I
amazing
did not
story.
know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Cold War,
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
enemy personified.
I think there have been multiple times that we were that close, but that gives a different face to the enemy.
Well, because prior to that, we just imagined them as soulless beings, who just want to destroy us, because
Mhm.
that's the propaganda we've been fed, and our imaginations see it in this one sided way. But as soon as you can humanize the enemy, that changes the whole equation. Then you have to ask, well, who am I such that I was projecting all of that onto this guy who probably has kids and a family and relatives and, like, loves them? How often do we think about that when we think about our enemies?
Right, right. What was the more recent movie with Russell Crowe, um, where he is number two to Hitler? Um, gosh, Himmler.
Mm.
Was he Himmler? Was he Himmler or was he another one of the
One of those
cast?
guys.
Yeah, one of those guys. I that movie came. It didn't seem to be last long, but I just watched it recently. It is a fascinating study on the humanity of the enemy. Here's this guy who had they show his wife and his child and his love for his wife and his child, and yet he can never ever let go of the ideology that what he did with the concentration camps was following orders and doing the right thing under his Fuhrer. But the movie is quite powerful in demonstrating, the as early movies didn't, and much still doesn't with black and white evil versus good. We have more sophisticated media now that shows the shades of gray. And when people are doing things that are harmful or violent to others, there is still a human being behind that. So maybe our whole culture, the Hollywood writers anyway, have shifted our perspective a little bit on the pure and simple evil in the world. That it is more complicated, more nuanced than when we grew up, and also more nuanced than a lot of the stuff that comes out now with the phenomenal special effects where the mechanics of who's fighting who and who's right and who's wrong are still oversimplified, but there's more of a spectrum and media representations than there used to be. So
Yeah, it's become more ambiguous in some ways, and to me, that's a good sign. Um,
yeah,
the it's interesting how so much of the propaganda that we're subjected to is trying to hijack your own reflection on your own conscience. It, in other words, it wants to be your conscience. It doesn't want you examining your own conscience. And conscience is the key to the whole thing. Because if you examine your own conscience, then you can begin to see the nature of the projection that you're placing onto these others that you're vilifying. And then you go, well, oh yeah, they have their own families and stuff. It's why in some of these terrible immigration stories, it's the one immigration story where they tell you about this person and their family and their children and what brought them here and the terrible things they've been through and endured. And it's the singular story that moves the conscience and empathy. But to talk about, oh, those Mexicans or those Haitians, like, what does that mean? Like, um,
yeah,
I was talking to a person, a relative of mine, who was saying he just didn't think that. What was the one about this? I couldn't believe he said it. He just didn't think he could trust someone who was a Muslim. That was it. Just couldn't trust someone who was a Muslim because of all that. I went, I'm never going to make a statement like that about a group of people. It depends on the person in front of me. There's lovely Muslims, there's lovely traditions within the Islamic religion. I love Sufism, like, come on. How can you even make a statement like that where you say, well, you can't trust this group of people? It has to be singular. It has to be, well, I don't trust that particular person, but I'm not going to say I don't trust a class of people. To me,
here's a
that's an indication of a kind of rationalism gone wild.
Fear
there's
conditioned,
a
fear
it's
conditioned rationalism.
Yeah.
yeah, back to a childhood episode that this just brought up is how I was I had so much there was so much cognitive dissonance in my my upbringing. My dad um uh would take me to Watts in his old car. His mechanic was black, and he loved going to this little single car garage. And my dad was very personable, and he loved talking to Willie or whatever the guy's name was. I can't recall now. And I just remember how my dad didn't just drop the car off and say, "See you later, Willie." He engaged with him. He obviously respected him. He could have taken this car to a dealership. He could have taken it to the wider part of the city we lived in, Los Angeles. But he went into Watts. He went into, black neighborhood to this black mechanic. I'm going, well, huh, interesting. And then later, my dad, during the civil rights movement, my dad would be talking about those blacks. They're always asking for more. So he could have these individual relationships
Yeah.
with people with those appearances, that identity, and still do this objectification by group.
Yeah. Why do you think so?
Well, a part of it, I think it was just his generalized conditioning around African Americans. Although I will tell you this, and this hits home with you, Mikhail. This gets to fear. My dad was also, I think, well, maybe not that during that whole time he was taking our vehicle to a black mechanic, but he worked as a physical education instructor at downtown Los Angeles Juvenile Hall. And he was working with who? He was working with the kids who were street kids and gang members.
Yep.
And he would talk about how they kind of strut around and they're
Oh,
arrogant. And
yeah.
I remember all his descriptions. They were all these stereotypes. But I think that there may have been an element of my dad was not tall and big like me. He was muscular and he was a bodybuilder, but he was like 5'7" or 8, and there were probably some pretty strong, tough guys. So there may have been an element of fear that actually that energy supported the objectification and generalizations,
Mhm. Mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah. I had an experience just recently, yesterday, Black American young fellow. Well, he's now in his late 30s, but I've known him for about 10 years when I lived in the States. And he just said, I just got, hassled at the school library at the university where I was. And I actually got tackled and I got put in prison for 8 days because he wasn't supposed to do whatever. He doesn't even know. So here was my friend. First time he's had that experience. He lived in St. Louis, but he got dinged finally. It's not an unfamiliar story, and obviously in the United States with police, especially racist-oriented police. And then he ends his email, and this is what I want to share with you and see what you guys think of this. He says, "I hate the United States." Of course, he's got plans to go to Africa. That's where he really wants to go back home, so-called, right? Like he's trying to make a new home. He thinks America's been against him ever since the beginning, and it's pretty much, you're always in service of, and you'll never be free here. And so when he ended with, "I hate America, I hate cops, I hate America," the word hate, how is it connected to what we've all been talking about even now, these shadow fear projections, fear conditioning, and then the need to put that into social group, in group, out group dynamics, etc. What have you think or come to terms with, or let's just explore it? This word hatred. I think it's a really interesting, strange kind of notion.
Mhm.
So let's unpack that a bit. Randy Morris, you want to jump in on that?
Well, the first thing that comes to me is to just review the basic mechanism of projection. The idea is that the ego splits from the shadow. The shadow is the part of yourself that you can't really handle being a part of yourself, so it's repressed. And um, and down there, under normal circumstances, it kind of lives. It comes out in these various ways. But when things get really tense, when fear begins to elevate, uh, you the normal way of containing that is through things like, well, the love of parents, who sort of, oh, well, you've been a bad boy, but you'll be okay because you're good at heart, that kind of. It stays down there rumbling around, doing its little flares from here and there, but under normal. But when the outer circumstances get uh, drenched in fear, the inner control of your shadow dynamics can't is not sufficient, and it boils over, and it has to be project has to go somewhere
Yeah.
because you can't handle it anymore. So it goes on to the enemy, and then you do the whole, the three fingers pointing back at you, but all you can see is a finger that's pointing at the badness of the other. And so um,
You're
there's
talking about anger carrying that, though, aren't you? Really?
Yeah. So
Carries the projection.
there's a kind of what Jung would call a kind of a numinosity to the intensity of the projection, which is an indication that some of your own personal stuff is tied up in it. Because it's not to say that there isn't such a thing as somebody who's out to get you. I
Yeah.
mean, there are like genuine
Yep.
enemies. But when we're talking about the kind of stuff you're describing, it's an overacting, it's an inflationary kind of overreaction to something. That hatred, that's a kind of a numinous energy. It's like I hate, that kind of stuff is means that there's something else there. It's not within the natural bounds of the way that the human psyche works. So I say it has a negative numinosity to it. And that's when you know that some of your own psychodynamics are involved in this whole project of naming your hatreds. And so,
Numinosity is almost like a greater other,
yes.
right? Because it could be like a divinity, a deity
Yeah. Well,
quality, and we
in
see
this,
that even in ancient tribes, right? They have their
yes.
negative deities and they have their positive ones, and
Well,
they're
what
it.
he's saying is, I hate the goddess of America. I hate the god that
It's
is
big,
America.
big,
Big. And I'm going, well, you've now gone beyond the question of who wronged you
right,
and the
right.
circumstances and the
Circum,
context and
right.
all that kind of stuff
That's right.
to the godly, the realm of the gods. And that's when you know that your own psychology is intimately bound up with it.
And is that a search for either one of you? Is that also a search for something bigger that can handle the container for it that you can't handle? It's like why is it made so big? It's like unconsciously perhaps it's actually trying to get a bigger container for what your own psyche cannot handle
Yeah,
in their
because look what
repression.
happens when you find a whole bunch of other people who feel the same way. You have community.
Whoa,
You have the MAGA community just like loving the hate. Let's all
loving the
hate
hate.
together.
Yeah.
I'm not weird. I don't have issues with my own stuff. Look at all these other people. They hate the same things I do. And there's a certain kind of solidarity to it, but it's a solidarity based on, dare I say, the problem of evil.
Enemy and evil are going to be really close here today. Randy, anything?
Yeah, I love the mosaic piece of the Jungian and part psychology and working with a approach to this. And also, I think what you're saying, both saying a moment ago, is I the biggerness is searching for a way to get out of the powerlessness and look for what I would call a false sense of liberation, actually. Um, the I think of the movie The Color of Fear, produced by Lee Moon-Hwa.
Haven't seen it, but I've heard it.
Oh yeah, it's a must see for this dialogue
Okay.
on this whole theme. There are it's really powerful interaction, and one of my good lifelong men's movement friends is one of the characters in the men's group. That it's a men's group of men of color and white men,
Yeah.
but the white man, one of the white guys is my friend. The other white guy was a son of a large winery dynasty, and I guess he's a vintner himself anyway. And so he has all these workers, right? And there are a lot of immigrant workers that work in the wineries, and they were all kind of trying to do a lot of self-examination of where, of racism and how they internalized racism And then the black guys were saying, this is how you internalized it. And the white guys were going, well, yeah, but maybe not. But in the end, at the end of this film, and this is a spoiler, but it's okay for this conversation, is it was really clear that that heir to the winery, the way that he was accepted, the way that his attachment to his father was to adopt the racist attitude, was to adopt even the look of hatred, whether in his heart of hearts he really hated the other. It wasn't clear, but it became clear that in order to be loved by his father, he had to hold those beliefs and he had to express them in some way. So we're looking at, authenticity and attachment here. You have to let go of some of your conscience and your authenticity in order to maintain the attachment
Right.
to the person that is
Love
providing
object.
that's
Mhm.
providing for you so much. And it's not stated overtly at the end of the film, but it becomes really clear where this guy's attitudes and beliefs came from, was that that's what he had to do to be accepted, which comes back to, that the connection of hatred and othering to belonging and identity that you were talking about, Randy.
Yeah, and as Jung says, the hardest thing in the world to do is to individuate, to actually be your own authentic self, because uh, the drive to belong with people who are not supporting your individuation process is really, really strong. In Japan, they have a statement where they say, the nail that sticks its head up will be pounded down. Because being in sync with one another in Japan is really, really an important part of their culture. But the whole notion of being an individual, of individuating, of finding your own personal myth, and advancing that myth into the world is the Western ideal, I think. And we could get into that. That's a whole other thing. But I do think that it is true that that's how I think about it. I want to individuate, and sometimes that costs me friends because these friends are holding me back. Um, they're not the friends that I need right now, or not that I cast friends aside that, but you know what I mean? It's like sometimes you're counseling someone and you realize they're just running with the wrong group for who they are. And they're going to have to make some hard choices here and really, in some cases, start over because their friends are keeping them from being who they really are.
Now you're entered the realm of remediation, right? How is it that we can work with what we understand about the mechanics of hatred and of fear and be help people personalize what has become depersonalized, right? And so one of my first experiences with experimenting with that was in the 80s when I joined people developing court mandated counseling for men who batter. And a lot of anger management programs and individual therapy was not doing a damn thing to stop the physical and verbal and emotional abuse in intimate relationships. So we were trying to come to grips with what could work if we know what doesn't. And so there was a remarkable Scottish immigrant who was developing a program at the Marin Abused Women's Shelter, a men's program. And he came up with this idea that you would use Sam Peckinpah's movies to create stills of the violence that the man had done. And actually, we learned that and we added that to our toolkit in the program I was developing. And what would happen was, first of all, we would talk about the three processes in objectification, othering with their typically woman partner, externalizing, that's the projection, minimizing what they had done, and then objectifying, turning that woman they said they loved or bonded with into the enemy. How did they do that? What was that process? Well, the psychodrama was unique in that we'd actually have the man write down an violent incident to the best of their knowledge and memory, and then we would have them break it down into segments and reenact. One of the men would be the woman, and the guy would reenact what he had done, and we would stop the action. We'd stop action, and in that moment, ask them, "What were you feeling? What were you thinking about what you were doing and her?" And what decisions were you making? Because obviously they didn't feel like they were making any decisions at all. It just happened, and there we are. Well, it was remarkable to create that, make it safe, and then see what the result would be. And men at the end of that would we debrief both the man who had played the woman victim as well as the perpetrator, and it blew their mind. They had some gestalts. I mean, they went, "Wow, I had no idea, that this was what was going on." So they were able to repersonalize their partner and actually do some real healing. And the participants in these groups were all the ones they were from, eventually they were some were on probation, but they were also voluntary student body presidents, and my own dentist were in the program. So it was not a particular socioeconomic group. This was a process that's widespread, and so that was pretty fascinating work.
Yeah, this reminds me of something. I think I learned it from Sam Keen, actually, from way back. But there's the impulse that rises up, and then there's the action. And the men you're describing, that's just impulse action, boom, 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 like that.
Yeah,
But
nothing between stimulus and response.
but if
No
you
moment.
slow it down, and
Mhm.
stop at the level of the impulse just before the action, you create a field of freedom, of choice.
Yes.
And there was no choice in what they did. They just boom, But it seems to me like, and I love what you were doing with that psychodrama. You slow it down. Okay, now right here, what's the next thing that happened, and what was the choice you were making when you did that? And
Yeah. I really like your rearticulation of that.
giving
Yeah.
the freedom of choice that was taken from them in the impulse action. Yeah, it's
Right.
I
Right.
imagine that being very effective.
You know,
And
that just shows up when stress reduction programs and all over the place. What's that gap between stimulus and
yeah.
reaction?
Well, I do
What
it to
is that?
myself all the time. It's like, wait a minute, like really, right
Wait a
here.
minute. Yeah.
This is
Wait a
what
minute.
raising what Jung means by raising your consciousness. Raising consciousness is creating the field of freedom so that you actually have conscious choice, as opposed to the 98% of the actions that we do that are completely unconscious. We just do them.
Right.
There's
Right.
no freedom in it. We're just enacting our habits. Same thing
Yeah.
with racist people, or people prone to violence, or they're just doing it. They're just doing it. There's no freedom there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then of course there's substance abuse that really knocks out the prefrontal ability to to see that you have some responsibility, you have choices, you're making decisions. So we would always make sure that the participants in the program were screened for that. And then if that was an issue, they might not even enter the program because we could do everything in the world with our modalities and our magic, but that wipes that out so quickly. And so the pervasiveness of substance abuse really cripples tremendously all of these reactive processes.
Yeah. So there, the focus has to be on just before you shoot up. What's that? Is there any
Yeah,
choice?
yeah, yeah. You nailed that. That's the choice point. Exactly. And that's what we were
But
working with.
past that, you're no good till it wears off. You don't get another
Yeah,
choice until
right.
it wears off.
Exactly.
I always think of, addictions, at least some of the better work and the better theorizing to me has got to do with um, you actually are killing yourself. Like you actually are hating yourself. You've made yourself an enemy, right?
Yes.
Like some part of the self has made some part of the self an enemy. And yes, you're covering up pain, you're making it easier to get through, but the long term of where it's going, especially when you hit bottom, you actually see you are actually taking yourself out. And it's just, you can do it quick, suicide, or you can do it slow. And so those are all pretty interesting dynamics when we come to hate ourselves. And then, when I grew up in the 70s, there was a phrase going around as, why are we the only species that spoils its own nest?
Hmm.
This is what part of foundational in ecological ethic and psychology of people trying to figure out, why is it that we have not the control, the self-regulator to say that's enough pollution, you're spoiling your own nest, and that will kill you. So it's like we have, some people argue, this inbuilt self-annihilation. I ask you guys as biologist types, we're all biologist types in early career, is it something in our susceptibility as humans that you would postulate that creates a susceptibility to self-harm? In other words, even to self-annihilation and communal annihilation.
Well,
What's the biology of self-annihilation?
yeah, yeah, it does. It is counterintuitive, biologically speaking. But for some reason, I'm going to start talking, and then I hope I can make a point of it
That's
relevant to your
good.
question. But it's just working intuitively right now. But I've always been fascinated by a statement that Thomas Berry, the great eco-theologian, says in various writings of his, that humans rage against the conditions of their own existence. I'm just fascinated by it. He uses that term, and only a few places does he really unpack it. But I've been fascinated. They rage against the conditions of their own existence, meaning that they can imagine something like living forever, but they can't, right? And they can imagine having abundance and wealth, but most of us can't. And so, because we can imagine it but can't achieve it, we rage against it. And what we rage most against is nature herself, because we're raging against our own bodies, because they give out on us. And we rage about that. And nature is doing this to me, and nature is like making me really uncomfortable. It's making me cold here and making me hot there, and it's like nature this, nature that, and we rage against that, which justifies the way in which we destroy it. And so there's something in that that it seems counterintuitive, because we ourselves are nature itself. We're a bit of nature observing itself. But that's a leap of consciousness that most humans haven't made yet. If we're going to survive as a species, they're all going to make it at some point. That we're a bit of nature itself, and we need to be in harmony with the ecological forces that produce us. So that's an ecological ethic. But still, this question of why do we rage against the very conditions that will allow us to continue as a species? And I think it has something to do with that. We have the capacity to idealize, but we can't make it happen.
Nice.
So, Miguel, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but as you know from prior conversations, I'm a big admirer of E.O. Wilson, author of Consilience and Biophilia, and in his 90s, before he passed, the trilogy, the Anthropocene series, three volumes. And what really shed light on some of this for me is that he would talk about the dual tracks of human evolution. And the dual tracks are, one is the one that's been focused on and distorted greatly, survival of the fittest. That's survival of the fittest individual. So, the biggest, strongest, hunkiest, most aggressive male, alpha male, is going to be the one passing on the genes, and so you're going to have those genes, and you're going to, you know, that's how everything's going to move forward. But he says, well, yes and no. The other track is, and you guys are familiar with this, is survival of the group, which requires a high degree of cooperation and collaboration to face, especially early on in our evolution, all of the physical challenges of maintaining an organism, a human organism. And he says the interplay of the survival of the fittest and survival of the group has great explanatory power in terms of this aggression, or this, this incredible energy that seems very violent, very dominant, and yet that doesn't hack it in terms of a group that's going to actually survive. And as a matter of fact, our human populations have been decimated into small numbers several times in geohistory and human history, where we probably might not have made it unless that small band had said we got to do everything we can to take care of each other to make sure we're going to get through this, or we're not going to survive. And so that interplay with those dual tracks of human evolution are, again, it's not crystal clear to me how that explains everything that we've been talking about, but it's really something to look at.
Well, I like the condensed phrase, it's not survival of the fittest, but the survival of those who fit best. Because,
Mm,
yes, cooperation. Now, not only between members of the human species, but between members of the human species and other species, that, that we all need to fit together or the whole thing's going down. And so I think that aspect of it Darwin got wrong. And
mhm.
it's those who fit best with the ecological systems in which they live is the real evolutionary driver.
And we do have two primate groups, one very similar to us and genetically in 90 some percent. The
Bonobos.
well, we have we have the chimpanzees and the bonobos. We're more like the chimpanzees and less like the bonobos.
Okay.
Although, if you follow Margaret Mead, we have the bonobos and the chimpanzees within our,
Yes, and
within our species, right? The bonobos using sexual activity to blow off steam so that they're not killing each other.
yeah. But what we have, maybe in the blend of that, is we have choice about our own evolutionary trajectory that other species don't. And
Mm.
I was reminded of that reading the headline this morning that there are over 2 million soldiers who have died in the Russia-Ukraine war. Two, not death, but casualties and dead and wounded. Over two
Wounded.
million men and women too. I imagine there's a lot of women in the Ukrainian army. Um, Wounded, lives forever changed because of this war, which nobody can really quite understand. I mean, it has to do with what? Russia is it, Ukraine. Won't go into all the politics of that, but that's what happens if we go the chimp route, right? But I think the point we're trying to make here is that we don't have to, because all we have to do is see what's happening, pause between the impulse to kill and the actual killing, and go, is this a good way to proceed? And create some conscious choice in the mix.
Yeah, we've got these very weak men that appear as alpha males that really create a field of energy that is attracting people in their fear and their powerlessness and their anger and their resentment and their frustration. And it is like almost like a tractor beam magnetic field. I think we're going to move through this tractor beam with Trump Putin. They're almost the same person practically.
Mm-hmm.
And look at how emotionally arrested and just really destroyed little boys these two are, but what they have created is an energy field that attracts all of the all of the hurt and abused and fearful. And so we have to break that spell. I think we are. I think it's becoming more transparent by the day, but it seems like it takes a hell of a lot of destruction to get to wake people up.
Yeah. Well, it's whatever that field is at the individual level. It leads people to commit suicide
Mm.
because uh, it's a self-destructive field.
Again, killing a part of yourself because it's just so painful to have
Well,
that part not listen, have that part not listened to and acknowledged. If it were, then the healing could begin. But it's the wound that festers within, right?
yeah. And the key, of course, is to deliteralize, deliteralize and mythologize out of the wound. You know, um, because if you continue to literalize, then Putin's just going to not stop at Ukraine. He's going to take, he's going to, and do the literal enemy warfare thing, encroach into Europe, blah blah blah, all that whole political, geopolitical thing. Or we can wake up to these leaders, uh, uh, dispel the miasma, the psychological miasma that's allowing these leaders to take the worst of our human nature and literalize it into the world and remythologize out of the wound. Yes, there are people who are being treated unfairly and are denigrated and have serious issues and that caused by systemic oppression and all that kind of. Well, let's deal with those. Let's make that the enemy and restore some of the positive aspects of the web of life that allows human beings to be in complex cities and uh,
Yeah.
international trade and all that. Those are ecological systems that can be healed if we start paying more attention to them. But we focus all of our rage on this other stuff, and we're not talking about any of it now. None of it hits the front page anymore.
Our time is up, guys. Wow. And I'm just going to suggest that what we're indicating here is remythologize, restory, re-narrativize, that basically we have to redefine the enemy. Perhaps that's one of the things we were talking about today.
Yeah,
Look
that
forward to
was a
your
great.
comments below. We'd love to hear them. We'll certainly comment on your comments if you do. Thanks very much for this today, guys.
Thank you, Miguel.
All the best.